At 48, he wakes up without an alarm because he doesn't need one anymore. At 26, he woke up early, not because he had to, but because he chose to. At 48, the city looks beautiful from his balcony. At 26, he chose saving over showing off. At 48, mornings are slow, calm, and his. At 26, he learned to control his spending. At 48, his laptop brings income, not stress. At 26, he learned how money actually works. At 48, he smiles at his portfolio. It finally works for him. At 26, he made his first small investment. At 48, coffee tastes better when there's no pressure behind it. At 26, he said no to unnecessary expenses. At 48, he flies not to escape, but to explore. At 26, he worked more than he partied. At 48, he walks through life without checking prices. At 26, he checked every expense carefully. At 48, peace has become his new luxury. At 26, discipline became his identity. At 48, time belongs to him. At 26, he invested in his future, not his image. At 48, his family sees a man who made it. At 26, he ignored the crowd to build something real. At 48, money flows quietly in the background. At 26, he built multiple streams from nothing. At 48, he enjoys silence without fear. At 26, he chose patience over pleasure. At 48, his savings feel like security, not stress. At 26, he automated his discipline. At 48, he laughs freely, no financial weight behind it. At 26, he carried the weight no one saw. At 48, his house feels like freedom. At 26, he avoided debt that could have trapped him. At 48, he reviews growth, not problems. At 26, he studied money while others ignored it. At 48, sunsets feel earned. At 26, he thought long-term when no one else did. At 48, his bank account brings peace. At 26, he built an emergency fund quietly. At 48, he drives without stress. At 26, he delayed buying what he didn't need. At 48, life feels stable, predictable, safe. At 26, he created systems, not chaos. At 48, work is optional. At 26, growth was mandatory. At 48, he drinks coffee without checking his balance. At 26, he tracked every rupee. At 48, wealth feels normal. At 26, sacrifice felt uncomfortable. At 48, he travels without guilt. At 26, he stayed back to build. At 48, he enjoys life slowly. At 26, he moved with intention. At 48, his investments pay him back. At 26, he stayed consistent when it was boring. At 48, he feels ahead. At 26, he started before he was ready. At 48, there's no panic in emergencies. At 26, he prepared for the unexpected. At 48, his time is truly his. At 26, he traded time to buy freedom later. At 48, he lives where he wants. At 26, he lived below his means. At 48, he thinks about experiences, not expenses. At 26, he controlled emotional spending. At 48, confidence comes naturally. At 26, discipline was forced. At 48, he builds memories, not debt. At 26, he avoided easy money traps. At 48, his life feels light. At 26, his choices were heavy. At 48, success looks quiet. At 26, the grind was loud. At 48, everything compounds. At 26, he trusted the process. At 48, he rests without guilt. At 26, he worked without excuses. At 48, wealth protects him. At 26, habits built him. At 48, he controls his schedule. At 26, he controlled his impulses. At 48, life rewards him daily. At 26, he delayed gratification. At 48, he breathes easier. At 26, he pushed harder. At 48, money solves problems. At 26, he solved habits first. At 48, he feels free. At 26, he chose discipline over comfort. At 48, his life inspires others. At 26, his life confused others. At 48, everything feels worth it. At 26, nothing felt certain. At 48, he enjoys what he built. At 26, he built when no one watched. At 48, the stress is gone. At 26, the pressure was constant. At 48, he lives with intention. At 26, he sacrificed without applause. At 48, this is freedom. Because financial freedom at 48 begins with discipline at 26.